Have you ever asked yourself, how far can a human being go when ideals, religion, science, and greed all twist together into a tangled maze with no way out? Tonight, we are stepping inside one of the most chilling labyrinths in history. Not a work of fiction, not a Hollywood thriller, but a real story. A story of a man who built a hotel not to welcome guests, but to end their lives. This is the story of Henry Howard Holmes. Remembered as the so-called father of the murder hotel, a terrifying figure who carved his name into the darkest chapters of American history. But before you scroll past this video, stop and think for a moment. What would make a doctor, a man once sworn to heal and to save, transform himself into something closer to a monster? Why would he take that path, and how did he manage to hide it for so long? To understand Holmes, we must also understand the world around him. Chicago in the late 19th century was alive with promise, gleaming new buildings, endless crowds, and the excitement of the 1893 World's Fair. But behind those glittering lights and polished windows lay shadows few dared to imagine. While the city dazzled visitors with progress and invention, Holmes's hotel hid something far more sinister. It looked like a normal building from the outside, a respectable business venture. But behind its walls were secrets, twisting hallways, locked doors, hidden chambers, and an architecture that seemed designed not for comfort, but for control. Inside those walls, Holmes played a double role: outwardly the charming doctor, inwardly something far more dangerous. So tonight, join me as we step behind the curtain of history, peeling back the glossy surface of Chicago's grand era. For behind its glass windows and shining lights lie stories of trust betrayed, lives cut short, and nameless bones buried in silence. Welcome, my friends, to the chilling tale of H. Holmes, the man behind America's murder castle. Imagine a cold winter morning in the northeastern United States during the mid-19th century. An old wooden house stands silent, thin smoke drifting through the cracks of its door. Inside a dimly lit room, a small boy trembles in his thin cotton shirt. Before him is not a gentle father figure like one might expect in stories of family life, but a stern man with a cane in hand and a chilling look in his eyes. He clings to a famous verse from the Bible: "Whoever spares the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them." To him, love equaled punishment, and the rod was proof of responsibility as a father. But to the little boy, this was not love, it was terror etched into memory. The beatings left more than bruises on his skin. They carved deep scars into his young soul. Day after day, he learned to swallow his tears, to bury his pain in silence, becoming increasingly withdrawn. What his father called education was, in truth, the planting of fear and isolation. In that household where cold meals and the sound of whips became daily rituals, Herman, who the world would later know as Henry Howard Holmes, began building invisible walls between himself and everyone else. And within that house, disguised as discipline, a dark seed was sown. It did not sprout immediately, but silently it took root, biding its time. The boy who once longed for love and warmth would eventually grow up carrying his scars into adulthood. Those wounds, instead of healing, twisted into something else, something monstrous. And in time, Herman's pain would transform into a nightmare for society itself. If the whippings had planted fear and loneliness in Herman, then another event carved into his mind an obsession far harder to explain: death itself. This fixation came not from books or lessons, but from moments that seemed accidental, yet they became turning points in his life. One day, Herman witnessed the death of his best friend, Tom. During what should have been a harmless game, Tom slipped, fell from the second floor of an abandoned building, and lay lifeless before Herman's eyes. For a child, such an image should have been overwhelming. Yet what unsettled those who later recalled the event was not only Tom's tragic end, but Herman's reaction. He did not cry, did not scream. He stood still, wide-eyed, as if his mind had been frozen in shock. From that moment onward, something in him changed. The cheerful, innocent boy seemed to vanish, replaced by someone quieter, more withdrawn, with a gaze that often wandered into emptiness. The shift became even clearer after a cruel prank by older schoolboys. They dragged Herman into the school's infirmary, shoved him to the ground, and placed a full skeleton model on top of him before running away in laughter. At first, Herman shook violently, gasping for breath, terrified beyond words. But then, as the mocking laughter faded down the hallway, he stopped struggling. His eyes locked onto the white bones pressing against him, the hollow sockets of the skull, the long, rigid limbs. And instead of only fear, a strange curiosity flickered within him. From that day forward, Herman no longer saw death as something to avoid. He began to ask questions: what lies inside the human body? Why must we all end as cold, brittle bones? This curiosity, fueled by fear and isolation, grew into a dark fascination with anatomy, dissection, and the secrets of the human form. But for Herman, it was not simply science. It was a doorway, one that transformed terror into fascination. And once he stepped through, that fascination would slowly consume what little innocence he had left. As Herman grew into his teenage years and early adulthood, he carried not only fear and morbid curiosity about death, but also a growing willingness to test moral boundaries. The transformation from a timid boy into a man ready to lie, cheat, and exploit corpses for personal gain unfolded gradually but relentlessly. At 17, Herman married Clara Lovering. On the surface, it seemed like a normal match, a young couple hoping for a modest, ordinary life. Yet beneath that veneer, Herman was restless and ambitious. When he enrolled in medical school, he quickly realized that the costs of becoming a doctor were far beyond what he or Clara could afford. Most students might have sought honest work or abandoned the dream altogether. Herman, however, saw an opportunity in death itself. He devised a bold scheme: invent a fictitious person, purchase a life insurance policy in that person's name, then procure an unclaimed corpse to pose as the insured individual. With the proper documents and convincing details, Herman could cash out the policy and pocket the payout. In late 19th century America, where death was common due to disease and accidents, acquiring a body was not as difficult as one might imagine. The fact that Herman pulled off such a fraud without hesitation revealed a chilling truth: he was unafraid to manipulate death for profit, and untroubled by the moral weight of his actions. Clara, increasingly alarmed by her husband's schemes, saw the darkness that was emerging. When the evidence became undeniable, she took their child and left him. This was perhaps the last chance for Herman to step back from the edge. Yet instead of remorse, he embraced his freedom. No family, no ties, no one to restrain him, only ambition and a taste for deception. From then on, Herman drifted from city to city, moving through New York and Philadelphia under shifting names and stories. Each time, he left behind unanswered questions, whispers of fraud, and occasionally, disappearances that no one could explain. If once death had been merely an obsession, now it had become his tool. And in this transformation, Herman began to forge a new identity: Henry Howard Holmes, the man who would etch his name into American history as the so-called architect of death. After leaving behind his hometown and the broken marriage with Clara, Herman stepped into a new chapter of his life, one built upon false identities and carefully crafted disguises. From this point on, the name Henry Howard Holmes would emerge, marking the beginning of a new persona, a new man, and the gradual birth of a monster. Holmes fully understood that society at the time respected people with education, especially those in medicine and pharmaceuticals. A doctor or pharmacist was not only considered prestigious but also inherently trustworthy. He exploited this fact to the fullest, using the medical knowledge he had acquired to build himself a flawless cover. Wherever Holmes went, from New York to Philadelphia, he always found ways to attach himself to hospitals, pharmacies, or medical practices. On the surface, he was earning a living and furthering his education, but in truth, he was expanding his arsenal of chemical knowledge and techniques that would later serve much darker purposes. However, the double-edged sword of his deception soon revealed itself. While working at a pharmacy in Philadelphia, a young boy died after consuming medicine Holmes had sold. Although there was no conclusive evidence directly implicating him, Holmes fled the city before authorities could question him. This incident highlighted his true nature, always seeking to escape responsibility, avoiding confrontation, and using cunning to erase every trace of suspicion. What made him more dangerous was his ability to adapt. Holmes did not just run away, he used each move to construct an even stronger disguise. From a poor medical student, he transformed into a polite and attentive pharmacist. From a failed husband, he reinvented himself as a charming gentleman with a constant smile. Yet behind those gleaming eyes and soft words lay a soul that was cold, detached, and meticulously calculating. If the death of Tom and the punishments of his father had planted the seed of darkness, then these years of wandering under false names were the water that nourished it. The scalpel Holmes once held could have been used to heal. But in his hands, it slowly turned into a weapon, a tool that would cut not to save lives, but to end them. And soon enough, the world would come to know the true face of this respectable pharmacist. After leaving Philadelphia, Holmes abandoned behind him a trail of unanswered suspicions and carried forward an identity more polished than ever. His next destination was Chicago, a city booming with wealth, ambition, and shadows. By the late 19th century, Chicago was a land of promise, skyscrapers rising, bustling marketplaces, and thousands of newcomers flocking in hopes of a better life. But this rapid growth also created cracks in the system, cracks that someone like Holmes could slip through with ease. In Chicago, Holmes quickly blended into society with his charming smile and pharmaceutical expertise. He found work in a pharmacy owned by a woman named Han. With his courteous demeanor and apparent diligence, he gained her trust. Yet, before long, the woman mysteriously disappeared. When questioned, Holmes casually claimed that she had returned to her hometown and had yet to come back. And just like that, the pharmacy conveniently fell into his hands. Authorities harbored suspicions, but in a crowded city like Chicago, with law enforcement stretched thin, no solid evidence surfaced to tie Holmes to the vanishing. From this foothold, Holmes took bolder steps. He purchased a plot of land in a thriving neighborhood, strategically located to attract both business and travelers. On this ground, he began constructing a massive multi-story building. The lower floors were designated for the pharmacy, retail shops, and other commercial enterprises, all designed to create an air of legitimacy. Yet the true horror resided above in the so-called hotel Holmes claimed would welcome merchants and visitors flocking to Chicago. From the street, the building appeared ordinary, even respectable. Its facade promised modernity and prosperity. But within its walls, Holmes orchestrated something entirely different. Each hallway, each staircase, each room was deliberately designed with a hidden purpose: to ensnare, to confuse, and ultimately to destroy. What the world saw as progress was, in truth, a carefully engineered labyrinth of death. Chicago offered Holmes everything he needed: anonymity in the crowd, opportunity in the city's expansion, and victims among the endless flow of strangers. This was not merely a change of scenery, it was the fertile ground upon which he would cultivate his most monstrous creation. The city of opportunity had given birth to a predator who would etch his name into the annals of American crime. As Holmes's grand building neared completion, the people of Chicago saw nothing more than a promising new structure that would brighten their neighborhood. But hidden beneath the polished brickwork and fresh paint lay a far more sinister purpose. Holmes called it a hotel, yet history remembers it by a far darker name: the Murder Castle. Unlike ordinary hotels, the castle's design was filled with bizarre and unsettling features. Many rooms lacked windows. Some had no exits at all, leaving anyone inside hopelessly trapped. Several chambers were lined with thick soundproofing so that no scream, no desperate pounding on the walls, could escape. Hidden in the ceilings were gas pipes, allowing Holmes to pump lethal fumes or anesthesia into the rooms, silently subduing or killing his victims without their understanding why. The hallways twisted in unnatural directions. Doors opened only to reveal solid brick walls. Staircases climbed abruptly into dead ends. Every detail, every irregularity, was intentional. These were not architectural mistakes, but traps designed by Holmes himself. They allowed him to disorient his guests, to monitor them, and to tighten his control. What made the construction even more insidious was Holmes's strategy to prevent suspicion. He never allowed a single contractor or team of workers to see the full plan. Instead, he hired multiple crews, assigning each only a portion of the project. As soon as their work was finished, he dismissed them and brought in another. This way, no one but Holmes himself knew the building's complete layout. He alone held the key to understanding the labyrinth. The basement of the castle was the darkest part of all. Down there lay his laboratory of horrors, a surgical table, scalpels, and jars of preserved body parts. Furnaces stood ready to incinerate remains. Barrels of acid and quicklime waited to dissolve evidence. For the outside world, it was simply a storage area beneath a fashionable new hotel. But in reality, it was a morgue, a crematorium, and a dissection hall rolled into one. To the casual visitor, the castle looked like Progress, a modern, bustling hotel that catered to Chicago's growing crowds. But for those unlucky enough to check in, it became a one-way journey into the abyss. The castle was not just a building. It was a carefully engineered machine of death, the perfect embodiment of Holmes's cold intelligence and monstrous intent. Stepping through the doors of the castle, visitors of that era had no idea they were entering a death maze meticulously designed down to the smallest detail. By day, the hotel looked no different from any other lodging, a polished reception desk, well-lit hallways, and rooms furnished with the necessities. But when twilight fell, the truth slowly revealed itself, a labyrinth of secrets and hidden passages, where every step could lead to a trap. One of the strangest features of the castle was its no-exit rooms. Many chambers had a door in, but no way out, turning anyone who entered into a prisoner of the sealed walls. There were long, endless corridors that ended abruptly at blank walls, as if they were built simply to confuse. Scattered throughout the building were false doors open them, and one would find only brickwork behind, or worse, a dark vertical shaft plunging straight down into the basement. Holmes also built an extensive network of hidden passageways running throughout the hotel. Through these narrow tunnels, he could move silently, appear suddenly inside a guest's room, or simply lurk unseen to observe. Some accounts recall Holmes disappearing behind a wall like a phantom, only to emerge minutes later in an entirely different part of the building. This gave the castle an even more chilling aura. No one ever truly knew where they were within the maze. Certain rooms were equipped with trapdoors that could swing open, dropping victims straight into the basement where death awaited. These mechanisms were not accidental quirks but carefully engineered devices, crafted using Holmes's knowledge of mechanics and architecture to create what might be called an early smart house, though designed with the cruelest of purposes. The most terrifying element was that, to Holmes, the castle was more than just a place of murder. It was his game board. He did not simply kill. He reveled in watching his prey wander hopelessly through dead-end hallways, panic against sealed walls, and finally collapse into despair. In this labyrinth, no one could escape, because every brick and every door had been calculated to ensure that all paths led to the same destination: death. If the winding hallways and secret rooms of the castle were where fear was planted, then its basement was the place where that fear became the most terrifying reality. There, Holmes created a space that was part laboratory, part hell, where human corpses were not only disposed of but also turned into resources to serve his twisted ambitions. Inside the dimly lit chamber, the flickering glow of oil lamps reflected off a steel autopsy table, cold and gleaming. Hanging neatly on the walls were rows of surgical instruments. Scalpels, clamps, bone saws arranged with the precision of a professional medical facility. But the true difference lay in the source of the specimens. These were not legally donated cadavers, but the unfortunate victims who had once rented a room in the castle. Holmes exploited the obsession with dissection he had carried since boyhood, transforming this basement into a lab of death. Many bodies, once murdered, were carried down and placed upon the table to be carefully processed. Skulls, hip bones, and other body parts were sometimes preserved as anatomical samples, while the rest were destroyed, either burned in a small crematory furnace or dissolved in vats of acid to erase all evidence. What makes this all the more chilling is that Holmes did not kill solely for sadistic pleasure. He turned corpses into a means of profit. At the time, medical schools and hospitals constantly struggled to obtain quality anatomical specimens. Holmes exploited this gap, selling skeletons and preserved remains to these institutions. Because demand was high and few dared to question the origins, the grisly products from the castle were easily accepted. For Holmes, it was a perfect cycle, disposal of evidence combined with blood-stained business. Moreover, Holmes kept some remains for his own personal studies. He was reported to spend hours dissecting and documenting, treating the death of others as though it were his private curriculum. This reveals that the castle was not only the lair of a murderer, but also evidence of a terrifying blend between scientific intellect and psychopathic impulse. In the basement of the castle, life itself was erased, leaving only bones, blood, and the acrid stench of chemicals. For the unlucky guests, it was the place of no return. For Holmes, it was the beating heart of his labyrinth of death. If the castle had already been a silent machine of death, then the world's Columbian Exposition of 1893 provided Holmes with the perfect fuel to turn that machine into high gear. Chicago, already a bustling hub of industry, suddenly became the center of the world's attention. Millions of visitors from across the United States and abroad poured into the city to marvel at the shining pavilions, the technological wonders, and the grandeur of a new modern age. But beneath the bright lights and festive parades, Holmes saw something very different: opportunity. The massive influx of travelers created a severe shortage of lodging. Hotels were fully booked, boarding houses overflowed, and countless newcomers found themselves desperately searching for somewhere to stay. Holmes's castle, conveniently located near the Exposition grounds, became an attractive option. It promised a comfortable night's rest at reasonable rates, but for many, it would be their final night alive. Holmes understood the power of anonymity in a crowd. When thousands of strangers came and went every day, who would notice a few that never returned? If a young woman vanished after leaving her hometown for Chicago, her disappearance might be dismissed as a runaway or a lost letter home. If a businessman failed to check out of his hotel, he could easily be mistaken as someone who simply moved on to another city. The Exposition provided Holmes with the perfect camouflage. Behind the excitement and chaos, his murders blended seamlessly into the noise of the fair. Inside the castle, the machinery of death operated with chilling efficiency. Victims lured by promises of lodging or work were trapped in soundproof rooms, suffocated by hidden gas lines, or dropped through trapdoors into the basement laboratory. Some bodies were stripped and prepared as medical specimens, sold to universities eager for cadavers. Others were burned or dissolved, leaving behind nothing but whispers of their existence. By the time the Exposition closed in October of 1893, the city celebrated its triumph as a symbol of progress and civilization. But behind the celebration lay a darker tally. Dozens of people had disappeared without explanation, many of them last seen near or inside Holmes's castle. The fair would be remembered for its dazzling lights and cultural milestones, yet forever shadowed by the silent harvest of death that took place in its midst. By 1894, the glittering lights of the Columbian Exposition had long faded. But in Chicago, rumors about people vanishing near Holmes's castle had grown too loud to ignore. What had once seemed like isolated disappearances, a missing young woman here, a traveling salesman who never returned there, began to form a troubling pattern. For the first time, law enforcement turned its gaze toward the man who had built the strange, labyrinthine hotel on the South Side. The Chicago police initially approached the matter cautiously. In an age before modern forensic science, proving guilt required more than whispers and suspicions. But there were too many coincidences surrounding Henry Howard Holmes. Employees he had hired vanished without explanation. Female companions and supposed fiancés seemed to disappear from the city as quickly as they had arrived. Even business partners who crossed him had an uncanny tendency to meet untimely ends. Investigators began quietly gathering information, interviewing neighbors, and following Holmes's movements. What they discovered painted the picture of a man who was not only charming and outwardly respectable but also manipulative and evasive. He was adept at slipping through the cracks of the system, changing names, and moving swiftly whenever questions grew uncomfortable. Yet the sheer number of missing persons linked to his orbit forced the police to dig deeper. Adding fuel to their suspicions was the mysterious death of one of Holmes's close associates, a man believed to have acted as an accomplice. Before he could be interrogated, the associate turned up dead, under circumstances that suggested Holmes himself had silenced him to eliminate a potential liability. This revelation gave investigators the justification they needed to escalate their inquiry. Soon, the castle itself became the focus of scrutiny. Neighbors spoke of strange noises at night, metallic clanging, muffled cries, the acrid smell of chemicals wafting from the basement. Delivery men recalled unloading crates of odd supplies, including barrels of acid and quicklime. And more than one person admitted to seeing guests enter the castle but never leaving again. The puzzle pieces were slowly falling into place. The police now had reason to believe that the castle was not a hotel at all, but a carefully engineered trap designed for murder. The decision was made: they would move in, search the building from top to bottom, and finally uncover the truth hidden within its walls. When the police finally entered Holmes's castle, what they discovered was far beyond their darkest expectations. At first glance, the building looked like any other large boarding house: neat rooms, polished corridors, and the remnants of a once busy apothecary on the ground floor. But as officers pried open doors, descended staircases, and forced their way into locked chambers, the true nature of the structure revealed itself piece by piece, and it was horrifying. Behind what seemed to be ordinary guest rooms, investigators found chambers with no windows and no exits, their walls reinforced to muffle sound. In some rooms, iron restraints were fixed to the walls. In others, they found trapdoors leading to narrow shafts that dropped directly into the basement. Several rooms contained hidden gas pipes, designed to fill the space with suffocating fumes at Holmes's command. Each discovery confirmed that this was no hotel. It was a death factory. The basement revealed the most chilling evidence. There, officers uncovered a fully equipped dissection room, a steel table stained dark from use, surgical tools neatly arranged, and vats filled with corrosive chemicals. In one corner, a furnace large enough to cremate human remains stood cold and silent, its walls still lined with ash. Scattered across the floor and in storage trunks were bones, some small, belonging to children. Others unmistakably adult. Among the items catalogued were personal belongings that tied the castle directly to the missing, jewelry traced to the actress Minnie Williams, fragments of clothing identified as belonging to Julia and her daughter. Even watches and trinkets belonging to unidentified victims. The macabre collection left little doubt that the hotel had served as the grave for dozens, perhaps more. Reporters swarmed the scene as the story broke, dubbing the structure the murder castle. The public, who had once admired the building as a modern hotel, now looked on in horror as details emerged about secret passages, false walls, and a labyrinth built to entrap and kill. The revelations shocked the entire nation, transforming what had been whispered rumors into undeniable proof. For the police, the evidence was overwhelming. The castle was no longer a place of business but a crime scene, soaked in the memory of its countless victims. And at the center of it all stood one man, Henry Howard Holmes, who had constructed not just a hotel, but a monument to death itself. The revelations from the castle left the public horrified, and the authorities had little choice but to bring Henry Howard Holmes to trial. What followed was one of the most sensational court cases of the late 19th century, capturing headlines across the United States and beyond. In the courtroom, Holmes appeared calm, almost unnervingly composed. He dressed neatly, spoke with courtesy, and often flashed the same disarming smile that had fooled so many before. But beneath this veneer, his testimony chilled everyone present. At one point, Holmes even referred to himself as the devil, claiming that he was born with an irresistible compulsion to take lives. His words blurred the line between confession and boast, as though he found a twisted pride in the chaos he had wrought. Officially, Holmes admitted to 27 murders and 9 attempted murders. Yet investigators and journalists alike believed the true number was far higher, possibly 50 or more. The personal items, bones, and remains recovered from the castle supported this darker estimate, though the absence of complete records meant that many victims would remain nameless forever. The jury had little difficulty reaching a verdict. Holmes was guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. But even in the face of his own mortality, Holmes sought to maintain control. He requested that his body be buried 10 feet underground, encased in cement, so that no one could exhume and dissect him the way he had done to so many others. The court, remarkably, granted his request. On the day of the execution in 1896, crowds gathered to witness the end of America's first widely recognized serial killer. Yet even this final act was marked by grim irony. When the trapdoor was released, the noose failed to snap Holmes's neck cleanly. Instead, he dangled at the end of the rope, convulsing, gasping, and suffering for nearly 15 minutes before finally succumbing. Many observers saw this as a fitting punishment, a prolonged agony for the man who had inflicted so much suffering on others. In the years that followed, Holmes's infamous castle was eventually demolished in 1938, replaced by a post office. The physical structure disappeared, but the legacy of terror it represented could not be so easily erased. Holmes remained etched into history not just as a murderer, but as a chilling reminder of how intelligence, charm, and ambition can be twisted into instruments of unimaginable evil. One of the most unsettling aspects of Holmes's story is how he combined legitimate knowledge with monstrous intent. Unlike many killers who relied solely on brute force or impulse, Holmes possessed a scientific education. He had studied medicine, chemistry, and anatomy subjects meant to heal and preserve life. Yet instead of using these skills for good, he twisted them into tools of control and destruction. The castle itself was a reflection of this fusion. Gas lines hidden in walls, airtight rooms designed to suffocate victims, and carefully placed trapdoors all required not only cunning but also technical understanding. Holmes knew how the human body worked, how long it could survive without air, how chemicals could render someone unconscious, how bones and tissue could be stripped and preserved. What might have made him a skilled physician instead became the foundation of his reign of terror. This blending of science and sadism magnified the horror of his crimes. Victims in Holmes's castle were not merely murdered. They were experimented upon, studied, and sometimes sold as specimens. In an era when medical schools were desperate for cadavers, Holmes exploited that desperation, supplying bodies without anyone asking too many questions. The very institutions dedicated to advancing human knowledge became, unknowingly, silent partners in his atrocities. What makes Holmes stand out in history is not only the scale of his killings but also the methodical, almost clinical precision with which he carried them out. He approached murder with the mindset of a researcher, meticulous, detached, and disturbingly pragmatic. For him, the human body was not sacred, it was raw material, a puzzle to be dissected, and, at times, a commodity to be sold. In this sense, Holmes represented a chilling warning about the dangers of unchecked knowledge. Science itself is neutral, it can heal or it can harm. But in the wrong hands, even the noblest disciplines can be perverted. Holmes showed what happens when intellect is stripped of morality, brilliance becomes cruelty, and skill becomes a weapon. His story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth: progress in knowledge does not automatically lead to progress in humanity. Without compassion and ethical responsibility, knowledge alone can become a pathway not to healing, but to horror. Beyond his scientific knowledge, another factor that made Holmes so dangerous was his extraordinary ability to conceal his true nature. He was not a crude or careless criminal. Instead, he was meticulous in hiding behind masks, both literal and figurative, that allowed him to operate for years without arousing serious suspicion. The castle itself was a masterpiece of concealment. Holmes deliberately hired multiple construction crews, assigning each team to build only a portion of the structure before dismissing them. This ensured that no worker ever understood the entire blueprint. Rooms without exits, hidden passageways, and strange shafts leading to the basement were never questioned because each team assumed it was simply part of another design. In truth, only Holmes had the full map. He alone knew how every secret corridor connected, how each trap could be activated, and how the whole labyrinth functioned as a killing machine. But Holmes's deception extended far beyond architecture. In daily life, he cultivated the image of a respectable gentleman, polite, well-dressed, and always ready with a charming smile. Neighbors saw him as a successful businessman. Women found him attentive and trustworthy. Employers considered him competent. This public persona gave him protection, making it unthinkable for many to suspect that beneath his friendly demeanor lurked a predator. Even when people disappeared, employees, lovers, or business partners, Holmes always had a plausible explanation. A young woman had decided to move back home. A colleague had left for better opportunities. Because communication in the 19th century was slower and less reliable, such excuses were often accepted without question. Holmes understood this perfectly and exploited it, using society's gaps in information as another tool of cover. His skill in manipulation also extended to the legal system. He frequently changed names and identities, taking out insurance policies under false aliases, signing contracts that allowed him to evade debts, and moving swiftly whenever scrutiny grew too close. Time and again, he managed to stay one step ahead of creditors, investigators, and even suspicious acquaintances. This ability to vanish into plain sight is what made Holmes especially terrifying. He did not need to lurk in shadows. He lived among people, sat across from them at dinner tables, and shook their hands in business deals. His greatest disguise was not a mask, but the illusion of normalcy. Holmes proved that evil does not always look monstrous. Sometimes, it wears a bowler hat, a pressed suit, and a smile that puts others at ease right before it takes everything from them. To fully understand how Holmes managed to operate for so long, we must also consider the broader context of the time. The late 19th century was a period of rapid growth and transformation in America. Cities like Chicago were exploding in size, filled with new arrivals, bustling industries, and a constant flow of strangers. In this chaotic environment, oversight and regulation often lagged behind. For someone like Holmes, the lack of systemic control was the perfect cover. First, the medical world itself was vulnerable. Universities and hospitals desperately needed cadavers for research and teaching, but there were few legal or ethical frameworks for obtaining them. This demand created a shadow market where bodies could change hands with little scrutiny. Holmes exploited this loophole masterfully, supplying specimens without anyone asking where they came from. The absence of strong medical ethics enforcement meant that institutions became unknowing collaborators in his crimes. Second, the legal and policing systems of the era were fragmented and inefficient. Identification records were limited, and communication between cities was slow. A man could move from one state to another, adopt a new name, and start fresh with relative ease. Holmes thrived in this world of anonymity, where the paper trail was thin and authorities rarely coordinated investigations across jurisdictions. Every new alias gave him a head start. Third, society itself was not well prepared to question appearances. At the time, there was immense respect for educated professionals, especially doctors and businessmen. Someone who looked refined, spoke eloquently, and projected confidence was rarely suspected of foul play. Holmes's ability to present himself as a polished gentleman meant that most people instinctively trusted him, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Finally, the sheer scale of urban life created invisibility. In a city like Chicago, with thousands of people moving in and out daily, disappearances were easy to overlook. A missing person could be explained as a runaway, a relocation, or simply poor communication. The transient nature of urban life made it possible for Holmes to make victims vanish without triggering alarm. In many ways, Holmes was not just a product of his own dark impulses, but also of his era's blind spots. He thrived because the systems designed to protect people were still underdeveloped. His crimes serve as a grim reminder of how vulnerable society can be when rapid progress is not matched by accountability, regulation, and vigilance. Perhaps the most disturbing element of Holmes's story lies in his psychology, a mindset that blended cruelty with creativity, turning murder into something resembling both an experiment and a business. Unlike killers driven purely by rage or impulse, Holmes approached his crimes with chilling calculation. He seemed to view death not as a tragic end but as raw material, something to be shaped, exploited, and even monetized. Within the castle, every feature was designed with a purpose. The trapdoors, hidden hallways, and gas-lined rooms were not random eccentricities of a deranged mind. They were deliberate innovations, carefully engineered to maximize control over his victims. In this sense, Holmes displayed a kind of creative perversion. Where an architect might see a building as a place to house life, Holmes envisioned it as a machine to extinguish it. Each addition to the castle was part of his twisted blueprint, not just of architecture, but of murder itself. What made this perversion even more terrifying was how Holmes linked it to commerce. He did not simply kill to satisfy an urge. Instead, he turned his victims into commodities. Bodies became specimens to sell to medical schools, skeletons became teaching tools, and personal belongings were often pawned off for profit. Even death was recycled, stripped down to its components and repurposed for financial gain. To Holmes, murder was not just an act of violence, it was a business model. Observers at the time were horrified by how Holmes seemed almost detached from his crimes, as if he were an entrepreneur evaluating supply and demand. In his worldview, human life held no intrinsic value beyond what it could yield once extinguished. This mindset, cold and utilitarian, transformed his castle into what some later described as an early form of an assembly line of death. The danger of such psychology lies in its ability to rationalize atrocity. By cloaking murder in the logic of utility and innovation, Holmes stripped it of moral weight. Killing was not evil in his eyes, it was efficiency, ingenuity, even opportunity. This is why Holmes remains so haunting in cultural memory. He was not only a killer but also a grotesque innovator, proving that creativity without conscience is one of the most destructive forces imaginable. Where others see progress, someone like Holmes can twist invention into a nightmare, a reminder that brilliance, without humanity, can become monstrous. When we look at Holmes through the lens of history, it is tempting to think of him as an isolated figure, a relic of a brutal 19th century. Yet in many ways, Holmes set the template for serial killers who would come decades later. His methods, his use of charm, and his ability to hide in plain sight resonate chillingly when compared with more modern names: Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer. Like Bundy, Holmes wielded charisma as a weapon. Bundy was notorious for luring victims with his good looks and seemingly trustworthy demeanor. Holmes, too, presented himself as a polished gentleman, well-educated and courteous, earning the confidence of women, business partners, and strangers alike. Both men understood that the greatest disguise for evil is normalcy, and they exploited it mercilessly. John Wayne Gacy, operating in the 1970s, used his community reputation to conceal his crimes. By day, Gacy was the friendly neighbor and clown performer at children's parties. By night, he buried victims beneath his house. Holmes used the same duality nearly a century earlier, running a respectable business above ground while hiding horror chambers below. The Castle and Gacy's crawl spaces were cut from the same cloth. Secret spaces engineered to contain lives that would never see daylight again. Jeffrey Dahmer, meanwhile, revealed the grotesque intersection of murder and experimentation. Dahmer dissected, preserved, and even consumed parts of his victims, treating human remains as objects of curiosity. Holmes, in his own way, foreshadowed this pathology by dissecting bodies in his basement lab and selling skeletons to medical institutions. Both men blurred the line between science and sadism, reducing human life to specimens. The parallels are disturbing because they show how timeless the psychology of such killers can be. Despite living in different eras, under different cultural conditions, they shared traits: manipulation, compartmentalization, and a chilling ability to turn ordinary settings into places of horror. The main difference was technology. Holmes had no access to forensic databases or modern policing methods, yet he still managed to evade capture for years, proving how dangerous intelligence and planning can be in the absence of vigilance. By studying Holmes alongside modern killers, we see that he was not an anomaly but an early archetype. His castle was not just a building. It was the blueprint for how charm, deception, and cold calculation can hide monstrous acts. And as later killers showed, the lessons of Holmes's crimes echo far beyond the 19th century. While Holmes himself has been endlessly studied, the stories of his victims remain far more obscure. Many of them were travelers, immigrants, or young women seeking work in the bustling city of Chicago. They came with hope in their eyes, often alone, and vanished into the anonymity of urban life. For some, even their names were lost to history. Today, they are remembered only as the unknown victims of the murder castle. This anonymity was one of Holmes's greatest shields. In a city overflowing with newcomers during the World's Fair, a disappearance was rarely headline news. A missing woman might be dismissed as a runaway. A salesman who never returned home might be assumed to have moved on to another opportunity. Families, often hundreds of miles away, lacked the resources to investigate or even the means to communicate quickly. In that silence, Holmes thrived. The tragedy lies not only in the fact that these individuals were killed, but also in how their identities were erased. Bones discovered in the castle's basement could rarely be matched to names. Fragments of jewelry or torn clothing were sometimes all investigators had to connect a life lived to a life taken. Without modern forensic science, many cases were left unresolved, consigning the victims to permanent obscurity. Consider Julia and her young daughter, two of the few victims we know by name. Julia was once Holmes's lover, trapped in a destructive relationship. She and her child vanished one Christmas Eve, and later, fragments of their remains were identified in the castle. Their story, though tragic, is at least remembered. But for every Julia, there were countless others, guests who checked into a room and were never seen again, their fates swallowed by the labyrinth and their names forgotten by time. This erasure compounds the cruelty of Holmes's crimes. He did not just steal lives. He stole identities, voices, and the chance for those stories to be told. Each unidentified bone in the castle's basement represents a silenced history, a family that never found closure. A name that never appeared in the newspapers, a life extinguished without recognition. In remembering Holmes, we must also remember them, the nameless victims. Their anonymity should not reduce their significance. Instead, it should remind us of the countless invisible people who are often most vulnerable to predation, the travelers, the marginalized, and the forgotten. They are as much a part of this story as Holmes himself, even if history never recorded their names. Holmes's crimes may belong to the 19th century, but the unsettling questions they raise continue to echo today. Chief among them is the issue of how human remains are used, studied, and sometimes exploited. In Holmes's time, the demand for cadavers in medical schools far outstripped the legal supply. This created an underground market where the origins of a body were rarely questioned. Holmes exploited that loophole perfectly, feeding institutions with victims from his castle while passing them off as legitimate specimens. Modern laws have changed dramatically. Today, most medical schools rely on legally donated bodies, with strict documentation and consent processes. Families sign agreements, institutions keep detailed records, and oversight committees enforce ethical standards. Yet even now, cases occasionally surface of body parts being mishandled, sold illegally, or used without proper consent. These incidents, though rare, remind us that the boundary between science and exploitation remains fragile if vigilance slips. Holmes's actions serve as a cautionary tale of what happens when curiosity and commerce override ethics. His victims were not just people he killed in secret, they became unconsenting participants in a grotesque industry. Their bodies dissected and displayed in classrooms far from where they once lived. That violation of dignity is as haunting as the murders themselves. Contemporary examples highlight how relevant this lesson remains. In recent decades, exposés have uncovered so-called body brokers, companies that profit from selling donated cadavers or body parts to research institutions. While not equivalent to Holmes's murderous enterprise, these scandals show how vulnerable human dignity can be when financial incentives intersect with weak regulation. The lesson is clear: science and medicine must not only seek knowledge but also safeguard humanity. Every body studied is a person who once lived, with memories, families, and rights that do not vanish with death. Ethical frameworks, transparency, and accountability are essential to ensure that tragedies like those of Holmes's victims cannot happen again. In this way, Holmes's castle is more than a historical crime scene. It is a symbol, a warning carved into the past, reminding us that progress without ethics can easily slide into horror. While forensic science, modern law enforcement, and medical ethics have advanced far beyond his time, the responsibility to honor and protect human dignity remains as urgent as ever. As the story of Holmes and his castle draws to a close, we are left with more than just the account of a murderer. We are confronted with a mirror reflecting humanity's darkest potential. Holmes's life reminds us that evil does not always come with horns and fangs. Sometimes, it arrives in the form of intelligence, charm, and ambition, twisted away from compassion and conscience. When we look at the blueprints of the castle, it is easy to shudder at the architectural traps. The gas-filled rooms, the hidden staircases leading to nowhere. But beyond the bricks and mortar lies something even more chilling, a philosophy that reduced human beings to objects. Holmes built more than a building, he built a worldview in which life was disposable, and death was just another transaction. Yet within this darkness lies a powerful lesson. First, it reminds us that knowledge without morality is dangerous. Medicine, architecture, and science are tools that can heal or harm depending on who wields them. Holmes demonstrates what happens when brilliance is stripped of empathy: it mutates into cruelty disguised as innovation. Second, his story underscores the importance of vigilance. Holmes thrived because his society had gaps in law enforcement, in medical ethics, and in the assumptions people made about respectability. People trusted too easily, asked too few questions, and failed to see the warning signs. That is why oversight, transparency, and skepticism remain vital today. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Holmes forces us to remember the victims. Many of them remain nameless, their stories lost, their bones discovered without identity. In honoring them, we acknowledge that every life matters, not just the infamous criminal, but also the forgotten individuals whose absence still lingers like a silent echo. Holmes met his end on the gallows, and his castle was eventually reduced to rubble. But the memory of his deeds lives on as both horror and warning. Evil may never disappear from the world, but we can choose to learn from the past, to strengthen the safeguards of law and ethics, and to cultivate compassion alongside progress. So as we step away from this tale, let us carry its lesson: humanity's greatest defense against darkness is not just intelligence or strength, but conscience. Without it, even the brightest minds can build castles of death. With it, we can ensure that knowledge, innovation, and ambition serve life rather than destroy it. Thank you for journeying through this story with me. If you found it thought-provoking, consider sharing it, leaving a comment, or subscribing for more stories from history's hidden corners. And remember, sometimes the most important battles are not against others, but against the shadows within ourselves. If you found this video insightful, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the upcoming stories. I would also love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us continue the conversation together. Until next time, take care, and I will see you in the next video.